Good afternoon. My name is Ania Pacyniak. I'd like to welcome you all here. First of all, I'd like to welcome Dr. Stephen Taylor and Mr. Karol Fjałkowski, our main speakers today. Welcome all of you who are gathered here today for the debate that will try to answer the question whether the Christianity is based by evidence. Dr. Taylor, Mr. Fjałkowski, thank you for letting us benefit from your knowledge today. I'd like to welcome you on behalf of those who organized today's meeting. And this is Projekt Kościół, a Christian Apologetic Institute, Panteon Foundation, and our First Baptist Church here at Kłodnicka, and on behalf of the pastor, also known as my husband. Our church, we want to be the church that consists of people who love God and His Word at the first place, and love and respect others, and are open-minded and interested in the world around us. And if you want to dig into the subject more, I would like to invite you for our next meetings tomorrow and on Friday that will take place also here at 6 p.m. So now, let's welcome Mr. Rafał Pańczuk, who will moderate the debate and tell you more. Thank you.
Okay, welcome everybody. I will tell you something about the more technical aspects of the debate. But first of all, I start with the available materials. At the back there you can see some books, some DVDs. So they will be available after the debate. The second thing, this debate is broadcasted. You can set your radios or mobile phones at the frequency 88.5 megahertz. And now, coming to the very debate. So, each of our guests has initially, for opening statements, 25 minutes. And starting the opening statements, each of our guests, our debaters, will tell something about himself. Then, after this part of the debate, we will have each 15 minutes rebuttals session, and after that we will have the cross-examination session. It means 15 minutes and each of you can ask questions to the other guest. And then we can have open questions from the audience. And finally, there will be a closing statement at the end of the debate. So I think we can start. Starting from Steve Taylor. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for being here today. A little bit about myself. I currently serve as a professor in the University of Liverpool in the Faculty of Science and Engineering in the School of Electrical Engineering, Electronics and Computer Science. My specialist interest is in mass spectrometry, and in particular we're working on a number of projects, one of which is the application of mass spectrometers in archaeology. So my subject, which was suggested by Mr. Fjałkowski, is Christianity evidence-based? Is Christianity evidence-based? This was a very important question, and I'm very happy to attempt to speak to that, if I may. So, is Christianity evidence-based? What I'd like to do is look at what is Christianity, and look at the basis for the question. Secondly, to define the terms. What do we mean by evidence? What do we mean by proof? What do we mean by testimony? Thirdly, to look at direct or eyewitness evidence, which in a British court is the highest form of evidence. And then, of course, indirect evidence or corroborating evidence, and I'm going to look at evidence outside of the Bible for the thesis that Christianity is evidence-based. I'm going to look at the evidence in particular for the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead. And finally, circumstantial evidence for the same event. Reaching a verdict. Every jury in a court has to reach a verdict, and tonight I would like you to act as a jury and to listen to the presentation of the evidence. I would like to challenge you to reach a verdict. I would like to challenge you to reach the verdict that Christianity is true. And so that is my aim in speaking tonight. And also, it's important when we look at evidence, we're looking at historical evidence as opposed to mainly historical evidence, evidence that will be presented in a court. It's important to consider what other lawyers have said about the evidence for the resurrection. We're talking of a matter of history, something that happened as a one-off event in the past, not something that's repeatable as we would normally consider for a scientific experiment. And so we're going to look at what lawyers have said and what historians have said, and then finally make some questions. So the basis for Christianity, I've chosen a letter from the Apostle Paul, a letter to a church, I suppose something like this church, only this church was 2,000 years ago. This was a letter written AD 54, 55, and it reads like this. For I delivered to you, first of all, that which I also received, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he rose again the third day according to the Scriptures, and that he was seen by Cephas, that's Peter, and then by the 12. After that, he was seen by over 500 brethren at once, of whom the greater part remain to the present, but some have fallen asleep, i.e. they've died. After that, he was seen by James, and then by the apostles. Then he was seen by me also, as one born out of due time. For I am the least of the apostles, and not worthy to be called an apostle, because I persecuted the church of God. That is a very important passage, written very early, less than, or 20, 25 years after Jesus had lived and died, written to a church of believers in not the same country, in another country, because the church had spread to Greece by this time, and written as a man, as an apostle, to his friends. He claims multiple witnesses, and also to be one of those witnesses to the resurrection. So this is the basis for Christianity. I'll sum it up. The life of Christ. Christianity is all about Christ. You notice in the passage, Christ is mentioned again and again. It's about his life and his teachings. It's about his death, and it's about his burial. It's about the bodily resurrection of Christ from the grave after 3 days. That is the tremendous claim of the Christian gospel, that a dead man rose again 3 days after he was crucified. All of this was predicted hundreds of years previously in the Old Testament scriptures, which are, of course, in the hands of the Jewish people, could not be tampered with by Christians. And, of course, the appearances of the risen Christ over a period of 40 days to multiple eyewitnesses in different scenarios, some of whom touched him, others of whom ate their dinner with him, ate their breakfast with him. This is the basis of the claim. And of course, the subsequent conversion of his disciples, all of whom were unbelieving at the start, some of whom were doubters and did not believe, but then were convinced by an appearance to them of Christ, and some of them were persecutors, enemies of Christ, and they became followers. That is the basis for Christianity. Let's define terms. Evidence, then, is the available body of facts or information, including whether a belief is true or valid. Okay, that's a definition from the Oxford English Dictionary. Proof, evidence sufficient to examine a thing, to establish a thing as true. and to produce belief as truth. You could think of proof as the accumulation of evidence. And of course, testimony is a formal or written statement, especially given in a court of law. So what we have in the basis we've just seen is a testimony there based upon the letter of Paul. It's his evidence. And of course, we don't only have the evidence of Paul, we have the evidence of the Gospels. Not one, not two, not three, but four. And I'm going to read out, there you can see these are evidence. Let me just bring mine up on the screen. So here we are, the evidence of the Gospels. So then, Matthew wrote the sayings in the Hebrew language and interpreted them as he was able. That was written by Papias, who was a disciple of John, the apostle. He's said to have lived around AD 130, but it could have been earlier. So this is 50 to 75 years after the event. And he attributes Matthew to have written the first gospel. This is backed up by Irenaeus of Lyon. Matthew put forth the gospel right among the Hebrews in their own speech, while Peter and Paul were preaching the gospel in Rome and founding the church there. So if we take those two witnesses, then we find that Matthew's gospel was written before 65 AD. Then we come to Mark's gospel. Now Mark was an interpreter for Peter. Peter the fisherman, Peter the one of the leading disciples of Christ, who saw everything from the very beginning. Mark was his interpreter. And Irenaeus says this: after that's Peter and Paul's departure, he means death, Mark, Peter's disciple and interpreter, likewise delivered to us the substance of Peter's preaching. Another witness, Eusebius: it is related that in his or Nero's time, Paul was beheaded in Rome itself, and that Peter was likewise crucified. And so the title of Peter and Paul, which is still given to the cemeteries there, confirms the story. So Mark is written after AD 65, AD 67, that's a time period for Mark. Luke, the companion of Paul, set down in a book the gospel proclaimed by that apostle. Look how careful Luke is to suggest that he has eyewitnesses. Many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled amongst us, just as they were handed down to us by those who were from the beginning eyewitnesses and servants of the word. Sorry, let me bring that up. There we are. Therefore, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, it seemed good to me to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the certainty of those things that you have been taught. Eyewitness account. Eyewitness account. And now Luke, eyewitness account from multiple sources, writing before 62 AD. We can establish that from his second book in the Bible, which is Acts. And the fourth gospel claims to be an eyewitness himself. So here we have John. John, the disciple who reclined on Jesus' bosom, in turn published his gospel while he was staying at Ephesus in Asia. So it's after Matthew, Mark, and Luke, but before AD 70, which was the destruction of Jerusalem. You can establish that from the evidence internal in the gospel. He says these words: this is the disciple who testified these things and wrote them down, and we know that his testimony is true. So John is claiming to be an eyewitness of the life, of the miracles, of the death, of the resurrection of Jesus Christ, and to have written these things down in the book that we call the Gospel of John. A summary: eyewitness evidence, direct evidence, the highest form of evidence that we can have. We have it multiple times in the Gospels of the life, the teachings of Christ. Peter put it like this: we cannot help speaking about what we have seen and heard. And just imagine, ladies and gentlemen, if you had been one of those disciples, would you not want to write down the things that you had seen and heard? And even if it was on pain of death, as it was for nearly all of the disciples. This is so important. A man has conquered death that you would want other people to hear about this. This is the basis of Christianity, and this is how it was born. The summary then, the picture, from AD 33 or thereabouts, the death and resurrection of Jesus Messiah, the 4 Gospels are written until AD 70, when the Roman armies came upon Jerusalem and destroyed it. But the evidence is strong as well if we consider, corroborating evidence outside of the Bible. Let me just see if I can bring that up to you. Yeah. So here we have the Rylands Papyrus, P52, which is dated from about 125 AD. Sorry, you can't quite see the screen there. It's a section of the Gospel of John. It's less than 50 years after the Gospel of John was written, or thereabouts, 50 years or thereabouts, and it's already found, this is found in Egypt. So already we have copies of the Gospel going round the ancient world, less 125, 150, dated by the handwriting, and it matches exactly the Gospel that you find in Polish or in English. These are the words that you find on that scrap. I've seen that scrap of paper myself. It's in the John Rylands Museum in Manchester, in England. It establishes a very early date for the Gospels. Let's come to corroborating evidence outside of the Bible. So these are not written by Christians. Josephus is a Jewish historian. Corroborating evidence supports other testimony. It affirms the essential elements of an eyewitness account. He said these things. About this time there lived Jesus, a wise man, if indeed one ought to call him a man. For he was one who wrought surprising feats amongst us and was a teacher. When Pilate condemned him to be crucified, those who had in the first place come to love him did not give up their affection for him. On the 3rd day, he appeared to them restored to life. For the prophets of God have prophesied these things and countless other marvelous things about him. Did you notice how many things Josephus, in his evidence there, confirms what Paul had written in the letter to the Corinthians? He's a non-Christian, he's a Jewish, and he's a historian of the first importance in the 1st century. Another one, of course, is a Roman historian writing at the start of the 2nd century. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, had undergone the death penalty in the reign of Tiberius by the sentence of the procurator Pontius Pilate. So here is then biblical evidence being confirmed by non-biblical writers, corroborating evidence as well as direct. Old Testament evidence. Here's a part of the Dead Sea Scroll. It's written about 100 years before the Christian era, about 100 BC. You can go and see it, of course, in Jerusalem. And it's a prophecy. And they made his grave with the wicked, but with the rich in his death. Jesus was crucified with thieves, but buried in a rich man's tomb who donated it. Yet it pleased the Lord to bruise him and put him to grief. When you make his soul an offering for sin, Jesus died for sinners, according to Peter and Paul. He shall see his seed, he shall prolong his days. He's going to die, but he's going to live. And the pleasure of the Lord will prosper in his hand. He shall see the labor of his soul, and he shall be satisfied. By his knowledge my righteous servant shall justify many, for he shall bear their iniquities. Christ dying for sinners is the testimony of Isaiah. Note the date, 700 BC, this piece of evidence from a copy of the original at 100 BC. And then we come on to another piece of interesting evidence. Here's a heel bone. It's pierced by a large nail from a victim of crucifixion, Roman crucifixion, 1st century, found in Jerusalem in 1968. It proves that the Romans did nail their victims to crosses. And of course, 1,000 years previously, David had said these words, "They pierced my hands and my feet. They look and stare at me. They divide my garments among them. For thy clothing they cast lots." 1,000 years previously to the crucifixion, David prophesied these things. He was never pierced hands and feet. Christ, his son, his ancestor, was, of course. So there's corroborating evidence from externally, and there's evidence which is written before the Bible, which also confirms it. Let's look at the direct evidence for the resurrection. In the first passage that we read, there's a number of times we find three words. He was seen. So Christ died, was buried, raised. He was seen by Peter, then by 12. He was seen by over 500 people at once, men, most of whom were still alive when this was being written. He was seen by James, who was an unbeliever, but was converted. He was seen by all the apostles. He was seen by me, says Paul, as he writes. Here's a direct, personal witness to the resurrection. Is Christianity evidence-based? I put it to you, ladies and gentlemen, that it is. This is powerful evidence. This is the evidence of eyewitnesses, seen on multiple occasions, 12 actually, by over 520 witnesses over a period of 40 days. Firstly, by Mary Magdalene, seen by women firstly on Easter Sunday morning, then later in the afternoon, then the 10 apostles in the evening, then the apostles and Thomas, then 500, then 7 apostles, then the apostle Paul years later. This is the evidence of direct evidence, okay? Multiple eyewitnesses. Now, we come on to the circumstantial evidence for the resurrection. To give a definition, circumstantial evidence is evidence, indirect facts from which inferences can be drawn. Indirect facts, okay? So, for instance, if you find there's someone being accused of murder and they have the blood, the dagger, the blood's on their clothes, they had a motive, etc., etc., you may not have direct evidence, but you have a powerful case against them by indirect evidence. Shall we look at the indirect evidence, the circumstantial evidence for the resurrection? The disciples were willing to suffer hardship, ridicule, torture, and to die for their beliefs, for no financial gain. Now, people die for their religious beliefs if they sincerely believe they are true. But men and women won't die for their religious beliefs if they know that their beliefs are false. A Muslim terrorist will blow himself up. He believes it to be true, he's false, but he wouldn't do that if he didn't believe that he would get to heaven, etc., etc. If he knew it was a lie, he wouldn't do that. The apostles, they knew it was true, so they did it. They wouldn't have died had they known that the resurrection was a lie. Think about it. Lee Strobel, who wrote this, was once an atheist, and he was convinced by looking at the evidence for the resurrection. For any who may call themselves atheists here, I'm glad that you're here. I urge you to consider the evidence for the resurrection. Hardened skeptics down through the centuries have been converted. The church has emerged. It was an illegal religion for the first 200 years, and of course, in spite of persecution, has dominated the planet. There is now more Christians and churches, more Christians than there ever has been, and of course, on every country and in every language, there are Christians. And of course, there's ongoing encounters with Christ today. Let me give you millions, in fact, from all over the world, in every culture. From all backgrounds, men and women, rich and poor, uneducated and educated, have come to the conclusion Christ rose. Let's look at what the lawyers say, okay? Is Christianity evidence-based? John Singleton Copley was a law lord called Lord Lyndhurst in the UK. That's the highest legal office in the UK. He was Lord High Chancellor of Britain 3 times. That's an office that's higher than the Prime Minister, okay? He said this, "I know pretty well what evidence is, and I tell you, such evidence as that for the resurrection has never broken down yet." Is Christianity evidence-based? He believes so. Another lawyer said this, "As a lawyer, I've made a prolonged study of the evidence for the events of the first Easter day. To me, the evidence is overwhelming, conclusive. And over again in the High Court, I've secured the verdict on evidence not nearly so compelling." Lawyers believe the evidence is there and it's overwhelming. What about historians? I claim to be a historian, and I say that the evidence for the resurrection of Christ is better authenticated than most of the facts of ancient history. Professor Blakelock, Professor of Classics. I know of no one fact in the history of mankind which is proved by better and fuller evidence of every sort than the resurrection. And that was Thomas Arnold, Regius Professor of Modern History at Oxford University in the 19th century. The lawyers believe there's evidence and it's overwhelming, and the historians believe there's evidence and it's overwhelming. So is Christianity evidence-based? Christianity is based upon the life, death, and bodily resurrection of its founder, Jesus Christ. There exists direct evidence of multiple eyewitnesses. There exists corroborating evidence of contemporary writers who were not Christians. There exists predictive evidence of the Old Testament scriptures, which were written hundreds of years before. There exists circumstantial evidence of the martyrdom of the disciples, the existence of the church, and conversion of skeptics. There exists a multitude of evidence which has been found to be overwhelming by leading lawyers and historians, as well as millions of ordinary people throughout history. Ladies and gentlemen, is Christianity evidence-based? Yes, it is. What is your verdict on this evidence? Thank you.
So, good afternoon, good evening to everybody. It's a great privilege, it's a great honor, it's a great pleasure to be here. It's a great pleasure to debate Professor Taylor. It's a great privilege to debate him. I used to be a Christian. I was a Christian for 13 or so years. And just before I finished being a Christian, I made a very short list of churches that I intended to check out whether or not I will go there to attend this church regularly on a regular basis. And the First Baptist Church, this very church, was on this very short list. Had I managed to get here before I deconverted, maybe I would still be a believer today, only God knows. Today, here I am, a nihilist on the pulpit of this church. So let me use this opportunity to express my deep respect for the hosts of this venue to let this event occur here. I'm an economist by training. I've worked on the Wrocław University of Economics for 8 years. I lectured in economics and ethics. Right now, I am co-founder and chairman of the Panteon Foundation. We engage in debates, we engage in interviews, we engage in analyzing and trying to find out what religions are really about and what arguments and what proofs and what evidence they really have at their disposal. Please check out Fundacja Panteon on YouTube and on Facebook. And I'm also an assistant of a call-in show, Stacja Ateizm, the atheism station. Please check in also Stacja Ateizm on YouTube and on the internet. Is Christianity evidence-based? I would like to set one thing straight first from the beginning, and this is the issue of the burden of proof. The burden of proof in a popular formulation, which is enough for tonight, the burden of proof is the issue. Which side of the argument must provide sufficient amount and quality of reasons and evidence in order for an objective, unbiased third party to decide the issue? And the rule is that the burden of proof always lies on the side which makes a positive claim. And there are good reasons for it. First of all, when you are introduced to something new or something unknown, it would be strange of me or of you to formulate some kind of arguments. It is, of course, on the side which makes the claim to explain and to argue and to give evidence for it. Secondly, it's illogically impossible to believe everything because different claims are mutually exclusive. So whenever somebody makes a positive claim, the default position is to wait in a sort of neutral state and wait until the issue is settled. It is practically impossible to believe everything. You cannot follow every possible claim. It's physically impossible. Therefore, the default position is to wait, stay neutral until the claimant with the positive case makes his case. And last and not least, it's a matter of prudence, because not everything people say in life is true. You may not have noticed that. And it may occur for different reasons. People may be deceived. People may want to deceive you. It happens, sadly. So it's a matter of prudence that you don't jump into somebody's claims just like that, but you wait until the claimant of the positive claim makes his case. Therefore, my job tonight would be simply to refute what Professor Taylor is saying, and I'm going to be doing that, of course, but I would like to do something more. I would like to provide you with some reasons why I think it's a huge and misleading overstatement that Christianity is evidence-based, and I would like to argue for this case positively also. How do you recognize an academic when you first see him? He begins whatever he's talking about by definitions. So let me just tell you about my definitions of evidence, and usually it's usually from a dictionary. Although I would like to propose a more rigid, a more stringent kind of definition of the evidence in comparison with the popular soft. Is this working? Okay. In comparison to a popular soft definition of evidence, which is similar to what Professor Taylor has just said, that evidence is one or more reasons for believing something is true, or an outward sign, an indication of something. I would like to propose to you the definition of evidence, which is more in line with the academic background of all of us. So, what is evidence considered in science? In order to understand that, let me just say a couple of words about the scientific method, how it works as a procedure. In doing science, you first formulate hypotheses about patterns of observable phenomena. Then you test the hypothesis by collecting and analyzing empirical data. Then you refine the hypothesis, you do further testing, further research, and so on ad infinitum. Now, because of this, I would like to define evidence as follows, that in science, generally, evidence is observable phenomena that reliably and unambiguously points to the truth of a particular hypothesis. What makes good evidence is that it is reliable and unambiguous. What makes bad evidence is that something is, first, unreliable, so it cannot be accepted as real or cannot be accepted as relevant data for the issue. And secondly, it is ambiguous, so it allows alternative explanations for the phenomena, for the data. Now, I would like to present to you examples of this from the field of evolutionary versus creation science. So let me give you some examples for what creation scientists don't recognize as evidence when it comes to the theory of evolution. So evolutionary scientists comes and says, we have radioactive dating. Creation scientists comes and says, radioactive dating gives unstable, conflicting results, and worst of all, it's dependent on the assumptions made by the researcher himself. Therefore, it's unreliable. It cannot be taken as evidence. The evolutionist says we have Darwin's finches, and Darwin's finches are the phenomenon that gave rise to the idea of the tree of life, the common descent of posterior generations from a common ancestor. But the creationists may come and say, this proves only variation within a kind. It does not prove variation that one kind can morph into something else. It does not prove speciation. So it's not evidence for evolution. Then an evolutionary scientist can come and say, well, we have fossils and we have the Grand Canyon. This proves that there have been long-time intensive processes operating. And so this is a proof that the Earth is millions of years old and so on. But the creation scientist looks at the same data and says, this came on as a result of huge forces operating in a very short time, so it may be evidence for a flood, not millions of years of evolution or geological geological evolution. And lastly, the evolutionary biologists may claim there are homologous structures, there is DNA in all life forms, therefore this is evidence of common ancestry from a common ancestor of all life forms. But the creationist comes and says, no, this may be evidence of a common designer which uses a common blueprint. Why did I give this particular field of examples? Because I think it's more likely that Professor Taylor would agree to my definition of evidence because we operate in more or less the same way of thinking about it. What is Christianity? I defined Christianity on these three basic premises. So there is a God who created everything, the Bible is inspired by God and true, and Jesus of Nazareth is the divine Son of God. Let's find out whether or not we can say that Christianity is evidence-based. Is there evidence for God first? Now, the normal evidence that is given for God is the evidence for design, which comes in the forms of irreducible complexity of life and the fine-tuning of cosmological constants. Now, the first thing to say about this is that normally what the creationist does is that he says, look, in life there is so much irreducible complexity, look, the universe is so finely tuned, and then he starts asking questions. Where did it all come from? Where did the laws of physics come from? Why is the universe fine-tuned? How did life originate? How is it possible that the life is irreducibly complex? And so on and so on. And this is what he counts as evidence for a God. Now, I put it to you that questions is not evidence. Questions is evidence only that we don't know something. And probably we don't know something yet. So, to put God is certainly a possible answer to these questions, but he is posited, he is inserted, he is invoked as an answer without any warrant and evidence. There are alternative explanations to the hypothesis that God created everything. First of all, it is real that science has not got answers to these questions yet. Science is an ongoing process. It continues it continues to search for answers for these questions also. In his public presentation, Science and Christianity, Friends or Foes, Professor Taylor says, science is always changing. There is no certainties in science. The Big Bang Theory is the prevailing paradigm in today's cosmology. Of course, it will change in 50 years from now. So Professor Taylor understands very well that science may one day, in the future, provide answers to these questions. So positing God today is premature, is fallacious. And there are also alternative designers. Of course, there is a long way from saying that something is irreducibly complex to say that the Jehovah of hosts exists and Jesus is his son. There might be alternative designers. Of course, if there is irreducibly complex life and fine-tuned universe, it might have been done by Allah, the God of the Quran. Why not? What evidence do you have that it wasn't? But it gets even more interesting because we have alternative explanations for a design without a personal God. Possibility number one, it may be physical necessity. Complexity, like for example, a mind can be a necessary emergent property of life. There might be a polytheistic solution, gods or demons, intelligent enough to produce life, but not necessarily all-powerful, all-knowing, and immortal, nothing that Professor Taylor would call God. Maybe there is a pantheistic God that Spinoza wrote about, who expresses himself in the nature as a physical nature. Maybe there is the impersonal logos that Heraclitus and the Stoics wrote about, the impersonal, pervasive rationality that expresses itself in the rationality of the laws of the cosmos. Maybe there is the Buddhists are right, and there is this all-encompassing impersonal mind, the radiant awareness that expresses itself playfully in the material world, for example, by producing life in all of its complexities. Now, my question to Professor Taylor in its due time would be, design granted, how exactly do you come from design and complexity to particularly the Christian God? What makes you so confident that it's exactly the Christian God that is responsible for all of this? Is there evidence for the Bible? Now, the evidence given for the truth of the Bible is usually as follows. The Bible claims to be the Word of God. The Bible is uniquely coherent. The Bible is scientifically reliable. The Bible is historically reliable. and it includes fulfilled predictive prophecies. Let's deal with the first two quickly. The Bible claims to be the Word of God. My humble and very much academic question would be, so what? Many books claim to be the Word of God. If the Quran claims to be the Word of God, even more so and even more directly, the Quran says, this is the Word of God. This is me, God, speaking. I have given you the Quran. This is my word. So it's even stronger, is a word of God than the Bible, basing on this assumption. And claims is not evidence for anything but somebody claims something. Now, the Bible is said to be uniquely coherent, which is not a miracle at all, because the subsequent writers knew very well the previous writings. So if that produces over hundreds and thousands of years of time produces a coherent book, that's hardly a surprise. And some churches boast that they have the Bible, some churches use this argument that the Bible is so reliable because it has undergone the process of canonization. So the books were deliberately collected and selected to be coherent. There is no God was necessary to collect a coherent book like the Bible. Now let's get to the more messy stuff. The Bible is not scientifically reliable. There is light. Hello? There is light without any source of light, according to the Bible. The earth is a flat circle. The earth has pillars and foundations. Above the earth there is a hard firmament where the sun and moon and stars are situated. Bats are birds, according to the Bible. In the Bible there are talking animals, at least one snake and at least one donkey. According to the Bible, you can breed animals with particular patterns of marks and spots on them by making them look at the like-cut shapes of wood while they are mating. According to the Bible, you can cleanse a house contamination by sprinkling the walls of the house with a bird's blood. You can examine whether or not your wife was faithful to you or not by making her drink water with the dust from the floor of the temple. We could go on and on, but you get the idea. These people don't have a clue about modern science. The Bible is not historically reliable. There is no independent attestation for all of the following. Humanity originating from Noah's family, the Tower of Babel, the existence of Abraham, Jacob, Joseph, Moses, Joshua, King David himself, the presence of Israelites in Egypt, the plagues of Egypt, the Exodus, the glorious conquest of Canaan, the glorious empire of David and Solomon, the slaughter of the innocents by King Herod, the miracles of Jesus involving thousands of people, darkness upon the earth at the moment of Jesus' death, many dead people coming back to life and visiting Jerusalem. Don't you think that those vast, massive, historical events would be noticed by somebody other than the authors of the Bible? But it gets worse, because there are some claims of the Bible that contradict what we now know about history. Nineveh was never converted by the prophet Jonah to the Jewish God, and so it was not saved. It was never converted, and it was destroyed. The Roman census, where everyone was obliged to travel to their place of origin, is a complete nonsense from the administrative point of view. There is no evidence that there will be any need for any such thing, but there is plenty of evidence that is organizationally burdensome. A staged triumphant entry of Jesus into Jerusalem as a Messiah without immediately being arrested by the Romans. It's completely out of the question. It's completely unreliable that the entry of Jesus that was deliberately staged according to the Old Testament prophecies to send the message that this is the Messiah, and the people reacting to it, welcome King, welcome son of David, that the Romans would not react. Pilate's custom of releasing one prisoner over Passover is not only not attested anywhere, but it's contrary to whatever we know about Pilate from other sources. Sanhedrin meeting during Passover night is completely out of the question. And I single it out because I suspected what was coming. Deposing corpses down from the crosses immediately after death is contrary to what we know about crucifixion. I think I'm going to spend more time about the supposed evidence for resurrection in my rebuttal period. The Bible prophecies come in three categories. First, there are failed Bible prophecies. The Bible prophesies that King Nebuchadnezzar will destroy Tyre, Alexander the Great destroyed Tyre. It prophesies that Egypt and Assyria will convert to the Lord, and nothing of this sort ever happened. The prophet Jeremiah prophesied that the Babylonian captivity of the Jews will last for 70 years. It lasted for 48 years. So whenever the Bible attempts at being precise at prophecy, it fails. So the authors apparently learned the lesson, and they became more ambiguous, so that to make it harder for anyone to pinpoint their mistakes. So if you take the book of Daniel, or if you take the book of Revelation, and if you read or see or speak with anybody concerned with Christian eschatology, so the theology of the end times, and they will tell you what the proper interpretation of these books is, then you will learn that there are at least 5, 6, 10, whoever knows, conflicting proper interpretations of these books. And each of the group claims that their interpretation is proper. Why? Because these books are written in this way. They are full of symbolism, they are full of ambiguities, so you can have all kinds of interpretations ranging from it already happened in the past through it happens right now to it is happening in the future. And the third kind of prophecy in the Bible is the recognized or written after the events prophecy in the Bible. So the messianic prophecies in the Old Testament fulfilled in Jesus are obviously recognized as such by the authors of the New Testament. So it's not a miracle that the people who wrote the accounts of Jesus knew the Old Testament prophecies. Now, how far-fetched is it a stretch of imagination to imagine that they specifically wrote the biography of Jesus to match the prophecies and not the other way around? And the destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans in the year 70 is prophesied in the Gospel. Actually, the dates that Professor Taylor gave you, that the Gospels were written before the year 70, is a minority opinion. The majority of scholars date, at best, they date the Gospel of Mark before 70, the other Gospels after the year 70. Is there evidence that Jesus is God? What is given? Miracles, his superior knowledge, his divine wisdom, his exquisite morality, and his prophecies. Let's take a look at is there evidence for that Jesus is divine? Jesus proclaims that the mustard seed is the smallest of all seeds, which it isn't. Jesus mistakes names of characters in the Old Testament. Jesus cannot make up his mind whether or not the Mosaic law is still important and immutable. Jesus reputably recommends to sell or renounce all your possessions. He recommends to not gather your riches, not to care about food or clothing, and generally not to worry about tomorrow. According to Jesus, oh, by the way, this is where it gets really serious. He repeatedly, falsely assures people about the power of faith and of the effectiveness of prayer about anything. He warns you against loving your life. He recommends hating yourself, hating your life, and he recommends losing your life. According to Jesus, it is appropriate that a servant is punished by beating if he did not know what the will of the master was. According to Jesus, it is necessary to hate your family in order to be right with God, and it's appropriate to leave your parents, leave your wife, and leave your children in order to join him as a wandering preacher. And of course, Jesus failed in the prophecies, which is not surprising because the whole of the Bible fails in its prophecies. Jesus prophesied that not one stone upon the other would stand from the complex of the Jerusalem temple, and we know that in Jerusalem right now today stands a big wall, the Wailing Wall or the Western Wall, which is part of the Jerusalem temple complex. Jesus could not even prophesy properly his own death and resurrection. He invoked the story about the prophet Jonas, who was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the fish, and so he prophesied that he will be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. Now, however you count, now granted the resurrection is true, however you count how long he was in the grave, it's not 3 days and 3 nights. And most embarrassingly of all, the coming of the Son of Man, the second coming of the Son of Man, the end of the world, the final judgment, was supposed to happen during the lifetime of his disciples that were standing there and that were listening to him. So what does the evidence really point to? There is no evidence that the Bible and Jesus of Nazareth are divine or even exceptional in inspiration or in person. So evidence I presented further indicates to the contrary. The Bible looks exactly as we would expect it if there were this was a collection of ordinary religious books reflecting scientific knowledge, cultural norms, and morality of the particular people, place, and time of their origin. Nothing about it indicates that it is a special revelation from God. Therefore, unless Professor Taylor provides evidence for the supernatural origin and content of the Bible, he cannot legitimately say that whatever the Bible says constitutes evidence that Christianity is true. To sum up, evidence is observable phenomena that reliably and unambiguously point to the truth of a particular hypothesis. Observable phenomena that are purported to attest the truth of Christianity are either unreliable or ambiguous, and in the case of the Bible, even contrary. Therefore, I think, and I propose to you tonight, that Christianity is not evidence-based, and furthermore, to say it is a huge misrepresentation of the issue. Thank you very much.
Now we start the session of the rebuttals, but before we do this, there is a kind request from our interpreter.
To speak more slowly.
Yes, exactly. Speak a little bit slower, just for him to make this interpretation. Thank you. Okay, start now rebuttals for each one for 15 minutes.
Okay. Well, firstly, I'd like to say that I did agree with many of the points that my colleague made here, Mr. Fjałkowski. I accept that the burden of proof is upon the Christian. And that's why I accepted the title that Mr. Fjałkowski proposed. And I've come tonight to try and show you the body of evidence written based on eyewitness accounts, corroborated by first century writers, which are not Christians, supported indirectly and circumstantially by the life of the disciples after the event, the existence of the church today, and of course the testimony of people, and I would humbly put myself in that category of people who would say, yes, I know what it is to know Christ in my life. I am sorry that that was not your experience of Christianity. All I can say is I travel widely to many churches and speak to many people, and it is possible to know God in a personal way. And I would say humbly that I'm one of those people who do. Not because of anything special about me, but because I believe God has worked in my life to assure me of the truth of these things. You see, I came from an atheistic background to faith in Christ. And what brought me to faith in Christ was the simple testimony of other people who were Christians, who knew Christ in that personal way. I saw something different about their lives that was genuine. I was impressed with it. And as I investigated the person of Jesus of Nazareth, I became convinced and I wanted to follow him. So I will accept the burden of proof. Thank you for that. My first point or comment on Mr. Fjałkowski's proposition is it's inappropriate to apply the scientific method to historical events. The scientific method deals with things which are reproducible, which can be observed. We all agree, we have agreement here. But when it's a case of something that happened in the past, like a crime, or like a one-off event in history, a famous battle, I've heard conflicting reports since I've been in Poland about who it was who killed the Polish officers, 30,000, at the start of World War II. I believe there's 2 accounts of that. Which one is right? We can't test that easily scientifically. We have to look at eyewitnesses. We have to look at the evidence. You no doubt have your opinion, as I have mine. So it's inappropriate to apply the scientific method to past events, we need to apply different standards of evidence. We're talking of historical and we're talking of legal, possibly forensic, possibly archaeologically, certainly the testimony of eyewitnesses should be included. I agree also that radioactive decay can give unstable and conflicting results. That's in fact my area of research, and I can say very clearly that is the case. So we cannot be certain when people speak about millions and millions of years, millions of billions of years. I can show you examples, and Mr. Karol Fjałkowski referred to them, of conflicting results in the scientific literature on this issue. I also agree that homologies could be interpreted of common ancestral past, but also, and better in my opinion, of a common designer. The same God who designed monkeys also designed man to live on the same planet, to eat from the same biosphere. And so it's inevitable there will be a large amount of DNA overlap, but nowhere near as much as is proposed by the theory of evolution, which is, of course, a theory. And it is interesting as well that Mr. Fjałkowski effectively has a faith position, because his faith is that the things we don't know now in science will be discovered by the science of the future. They haven't been discovered yet, but he has great faith that in the future science will give us all of the answers. And he's ascribing an explanatory power to science that in fact is a God of the gaps argument. Because you're saying, we don't know all the answers now, which is true, but science will tell us all the answers in the future, which is faith. So there's some points to begin with. Regarding alternative designers, how do we know which God is true? Or could I rephrase your question, which religion is right? Is that fair? Well, I would suggest my presentation gives the answer to that question. Which religion is right? Is Muhammad alive or is he dead? Is Buddha alive or is he dead? Is Confucius alive or is he dead? Is Lenin alive or is he dead? Well, we know the answers. Jesus is alive. He was dead. And the truth and the basis of Christianity is the resurrection, bodily, visibly, attested by hundreds, of its founder from the grave. That's how we know which religion is right, which one is alive. And of course, Islam, Buddhism, Confucianism, etc. No other religion even makes the claim that their founder would rise, did rise, has risen. But that is the basis. That is the rock on which the church is built. The deity of Christ, proven by his resurrection from the dead. He was declared to be the Son of God with power by his resurrection from the grave. So how do we know which religion is right? The resurrection tells us which religion is right. Design granted. Well, I'm glad that you grant design. I used to work as a designer. I teach design at master's level at university. I've taught design at master's level at University of Liverpool. I know good design, and I know so often how hard it is to get designs to work for the very first time. Most designs don't. So when you see stunning design, such as in the ATP synthase motor, vastly more efficient at the microscale than anything we can engineer, to me, it shouts the wonder of a designer who is in fact the creator. And that's my position. Design granted, and of course we believe that the Christian position is that the God of creation became the baby of Bethlehem and the man, Jesus Christ, who was able to do the wonderful things and to prove it all by rising again from the grave. The Quran claims to be the word of God. Well, it might well do. But of course, the Quran is refuted by the Bible. The two are in opposition. You cannot have the Bible and the Quran being true because they oppose each other in many, many different ways. There is a choice there. You can examine the truth claims of either. For me, I'm convinced about Jesus and not about Muhammad. That would be another debate, perhaps with another colleague. The Bible is not scientifically reliable, so Mr. Fjałkowski says, not historically reliable, and so on and so forth. I dispute and disagree with all of those statements that were there. It's not long enough in 15 minutes to go through them. I can say I have investigated many, if not all, of them, and have found alternative explanations which fit the text, which do not involve taking passages out of their context. And I can honestly say I can find I know of no historical fact that's contrary to the Bible. I know of no scientific fact that's proven. Assertion may be, but not a proof that's contrary to the Bible. And I know of no archaeological evidence that's contrary to the Bible. What we find is that there are apparent discrepancies, yes, but these are resolved through subsequent investigation. And there's many examples of that. If you have a chance to go to London and to walk around the British Museum, you will find artifact after artifact after artifact in room after room, which upholds, confirms places, names, details as they're found in the Bible. Please, don't take my word for it. Go and check it. Walk through the British Museum. There's a guide you can buy very easily, which will give you very many things. And perhaps the organisers of this conference may well consider inviting a specialist witness to say that, to show you that. So I would dispute any of the claims that my colleague makes. And similarly, Bible prophecy I find to be completely reliable. There are some prophecies which have not yet been fulfilled. That doesn't mean that they are unreliable. It just means they are for some time in the future. The ones I've referred to in my talk have been completely, literally, definitely fulfilled. I ask you to examine that for yourself. So there are my final point. Some of the points that Mr. Fjałkowski makes in his speech are assertions. And so my question would be to him, bullet by bullet, how do you know and can you prove it? That would be a fair question, I think. And we would have to have a long time to go through bullet by bullet. I'll make one point. Sometimes there is no other evidence than what is in the Bible, sometimes. That doesn't mean it's not true. Okay? Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. It is a logical fallacy to say that because something isn't corroborated outside of the Bible, therefore it is not true. Okay? Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. And of course, in my talk, I was concerned, because of the burden of proof, to show the positive evidence which has been corroborated outside of the Bible and which, so far, has not been responded to or replied to. Is Christianity evidence-based? Again, I return to that question and I say it is. It's evidence of direct sort, of a circumstantial sort, corroborated by external witnesses, and also the added dimension of being predicted in the Old Testament. The last point I will make is this. Could Jesus have staged, because the death of Jesus was deliberately staged. How could that be? Because the death of Jesus was in fact the machinations of the Jewish Sanhedrin and the Pilate, Pontius Pilate, who put Jesus on trial and ordered his death. It was not something that was organized by the Christians. In fact, they were devastated by it. If you read the gospel accounts, they scattered, they fled. And of course, one of them denied that he knew Jesus. This was not something that was in the disciples' control. It was something that was in the control of the Roman authorities and the Jewish Sanhedrin. So, in summary then, Christianity is evidence-based. The other points that Mr. Fjałkowski has touched upon, I would dispute, and they are probably the subject of another debate at another time. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Professor Taylor. Now, Mr. Karol Fjałkowski, 15 minutes for your rebuttal.
This is such a short amount of time. Let me start with the resurrection first, because this is so important, that this is the bedrock, this is the basis for Christianity. Professor Taylor emphasizes that the belief in resurrection is evidence-based, so let me deal with it first, and whatever time is left, I will deal with other issues. Professor Taylor says that we have eyewitness testimony for the resurrection, which is not exactly true. We have a testimony of the Bible that we have the eyewitness testimony of the resurrection. We are not dealing with the testimony of the eyewitnesses. We are dealing with a testimony of a book about a testimony of eyewitnesses. And this is something that we must not forget. Professor Taylor says that what gives credibility to the accounts of resurrection is that Christianity actually historically started, but so did Mormonism, so did Islam, which both at their beginnings had their founders, both Joseph Smith and Muhammad, undergoing hardships in the name of their faith, even to the point of the threat to their lives. They had to move, they had to escape, their life was at stake. And is it evidence that Muhammad really met the angel Jibril in the cave just because he was ready to sacrifice much of his own well-established life at the moment he supposedly received the revelations? And by the way, this giving of life by the apostles for the truth of the resurrection is also included in the tradition. It's not attested by any independent source. Professor Taylor mentioned encounters with the living Jesus. Well, I bet Professor Taylor would be interested in one encounter with the living Jesus that took place on Polish soil. The most famous encounter of a Polish person with Jesus is the one that a Polish nun, Faustyna Kowalska, had. And Jesus told her that in order for you to be saved, you have to belong to the one and true Catholic Church. I bet you are interested in this, if you're interested in encounters with the living Jesus. Now, what is the positive case that resurrection is historically out of the question? The most important thing to understand is the kind of punishment that crucifixion was. I put it to you that resurrection is out of the question because there was no empty grave, because Jesus was not buried. And this comes from what is the point of a punishment like a crucifixion. The punishment like a crucifixion is intended to deter people who would want to follow and go in the footsteps of the one who is put to death by crucifixion. So it is a matter of deterrence. It was done in a public place. It was done in a place where many people can come and see. This is the point of hanging somebody on the gallows, of impaling somebody, of hanging somebody on the cross, that for a long time his rotting body serves as a warning for everybody that would be so inclined to do whatever this poor fellow just did. We have evidence for that, although no official documents, but people such as Horace or Cicero write about people hanging on the crosses, that they rot on the crosses and they are getting eaten by crows on the crosses. They don't get deposed from the crosses 3 hours after crucifixion. We have evidence like the case of the army of Spartacus, which after their defeat, 6,000 people were hanged on the crosses along Via Appia. This was one of the main roads in Italy. It took 200 kilometers to hang them all along the road. Why would it be done if the point was to just inflict suffering? Crucifixion was not just to inflict suffering. It was to inflict suffering publicly and for a long time. Pilate put a plaque on the cross. It said, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. Do you really think he put on the plaque for 3 hours for people to see? Or maybe it was for people to see for many days that they will be passing the cross. He even argued with the Pharisees, with the temple priests about the content of the plaque. It was so important. Jesus was put to death by crucifixion for the hardest possible crime, for the highest possible treason. If it was true that Jesus claimed to be the Messiah, or he was understood to be the Messiah, then he was the most dangerous person in the land, because he might be a leader of a rebellion. Therefore, it especially makes sense that this particular guy hangs on the cross as long as it's possible to show everybody that this is out of the question. Rome will not tolerate this. One more, we are told that Jesus was deposed and put to grave by the good virtue of Joseph of Arimathea, that Joseph of Arimathea went to Pilate. He asked Pilate to have the body of Jesus deposed. This is very much unlikely, first of all because of the reason I just mentioned. Why would Pilate, who we know from Flavius Josephus was very much in conflict with the Jews, why would Pilate allow that? He disagreed with the priests about the message on the cross. Why would he allow a member of the Sanhedrin to have his way with the Jesus body? And the more important, the more interesting issue is that Joseph of Arimathea was probably invented as a person. Point number one, where is Arimathea? I would like Professor Taylor to find the city of Arimathea whenever it is. And there is not only he was probably very quickly invented then, but there is a reason that Joseph of Arimathea was invented. He asked Pilate for the body of Jesus, and then he put it in the tomb that was prepared for him of one of his friends. And believe it or not, Professor Taylor gave you the reason why we can sensibly believe that Joseph of Arimathea was invented. Joseph of Arimathea was invented in order to fulfill the prophecy of Isaiah that the suffering Messiah is going to have a grave among the wicked, and in that he will be equal with the rich. In order to fulfill this prophecy, it was somehow necessary for the authors of the Gospels to invent a person who would take the body down from the cross and put it into the supposed grave. For all of these reasons, it's extremely unlikely that the burial of Jesus ever took place, and so it's extremely unlikely by extension that resurrection ever took place. Now, what can I... Okay. I liked very much, I agree with the part of the definition of the evidence that Professor Taylor gave, which said available facts. This is, I cannot emphasize it too much. Available facts. The testimonies of the apostles, the testimonies of people who supposedly met Jesus are beyond what is available facts. What is available facts to us is the Bible. And the Bible is not a neutral book. The Bible was written by people with vested interests. Then Professor Taylor spoke about Eusebius. He spoke about Irenaeus. He spoke about neutral people, neutral, disinterested historians. No, he mentioned preachers, pastors. He mentioned Eusebius, which was a historian, but who worked at the court of Constantine and the next line of emperors in the 4th century. Those people were very much interested to present the positive case for Christianity, not to evaluate the evidence. Now, if Professor Taylor says, had you been there, would you not want to write about Jesus, his life and death and resurrection? Well, then my question is, why didn't they write about all of this for 35 years or so? Why should we wait for the first gospel 35 years after the events? Is it really reliable? Professor mentioned that in English courts, the eyewitness testimony is a very high valued evidence. which is strange because, for example, in the Polish legal system, the eyewitness testimony is the least favored, is the least reliable source, and there are good reasons for it. If you Google or if you get interested in anything that sounds like forensic psychology, you will know tens and hundreds of reasons, well-documented, evidence-based psychological reasons, why eyewitness testimony is the least reliable evidence, the least reliable proof that you can use in a court of law. I had the opportunity, after I left the university, I had the opportunity to actually work in a court of law as a secretary. I was there at the proceedings of the courts, and between the cases, as you can imagine, I tormented the judges so that they can tell me how exactly they make decisions, how they evaluate evidence, and so on. And I can testify from my own experience, and I am an eyewitness, contrary to Paul and others, that the eyewitness account is the least reliable, most problematic kind of evidence you can possibly have in a court of law. Professor Taylor mentioned outside non-biblical, non-biblical sources. Something's going on. Hello? Am I audible? Good. Outside non-biblical sources, he mentioned Flavius Josephus, he mentioned the Testimonium Flavianum, which, if you Google it, turns out to be almost certainly a forgery and almost certainly made by Eusebius. Testimonium Flavianum is not in its place. It's in a very weird context. It uses different vocabulary than Josephus normally uses. Nobody cites, this is especially interesting, the fathers of the church like Flavius Josephus very much. They cite him all over the place because he's a very good source for the historical background of first century Israel and the relations between Jews and Romans. And for the first 300 years of Christianity, nobody cites this particular piece of Josephus when he testifies to the existence of Jesus until Eusebius, who lives in a time when this kind of testimony would be very, very useful. So for all these reasons, the majority opinion of the scholars is that Testimonium Flavianum is obviously a 4th century forgery, probably made by Eusebius of Caesarea. Professor Taylor mentioned Tacitus, and rightly so, because it's the only ancient historian who mentions Jesus by name, not just Christians, but Jesus Christ by name. But the problem is, Professor Taylor showed you one sentence out of the context of the whole paragraph. And if you read the context of the whole paragraph, it's not clear at all. Tacitus, in this paragraph, relates the event of the burning of Rome and how Nero redirected the blame for burning of Rome to the Christians. And if you read the whole paragraph, you will see that this is not at all clear if Tacitus attests to the existence of Jesus, or is he relating what Christians believe about the existence of Jesus. So let me, oh yeah. One more thing about the prophecies and the Old Testament prophecies. New Testament, let me say it again because Professor Taylor mentioned it again. New Testament was written after the Old Testament. I think we can agree on that. Great. Now, the New Testament writers had massive interest to show to the Jews that Jesus is the Christ. You can see these efforts if you read the Acts of the Apostles. You can see these efforts, how Paul the Apostle goes from synagogue to synagogue, and he tries to produce scriptures to show to the Jews that, in fact, Jesus was prophesied in the Old Testament. This is a small bit of a greater effort that these people did. For example, the author of the Gospel of Matthew, who writes for the Jews, does it very frequently. He refers an event, and then he invokes a prophecy from the Old Testament, almost always totally out of context, but this is his right as an inspired author. And you can see how he wishes to find Jesus in the Old Testament. This is their effort, because they want to show that Jesus is present in the Old Testament at any cost. Therefore, it's not a big stretch of imagination, I imagine, to imagine that they say, let's write the Gospels so that it seems like Jesus fulfilled the prophecies. Professor Taylor mentioned Psalm 22. Psalm 22 says, among other things, that they have cast a lot for my clothing. And then in the Gospel of Luke and in the Gospel of John, you read about Roman soldiers casting lots about the clothing of Jesus when he gets crucified. Now, is it really so hard to imagine that a well-intentioned Christian would like to propagate his faith that changed his life, that gave his life meaning, propagate it by means of inserting in the account things that have not in fact occurred, so that it is more likely for the readers to conclude that Jesus was in fact the fulfillment of all the Old Testament prophecies? I think it's not very much unlikely. People say untruth for many different reasons. We cannot trust everything that people say. The burden of proof is on the side that claims something, because for many different reasons we have to be cautious, we have to be prudent. And just to use my last 15 seconds, thank you, it is a misrepresentation to say that my position is faith-based about science. I didn't say at all that I believe that science one day will resolve these issues. I said, I think, and I think that you think, that it is possible that one day science will resolve these questions. This is all I said. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Now we start the time of cross-examination. And I believe we start with one question, 1 minute, and the answer, 4 minutes. And then the opponent, again, one question, 1 minute, and answer, 4 minutes. So 3 questions, 3 answers, but I think we will be exchanging each other. So 1 question, 1 answer, and then...
Can I have a question of order?
We can do both. So first, 3 questions, 3 answer, and then... Or 1 question, 1 answer, and then opponent starts again. So which is better?
I think we would like a less structured debate.
Yes, so 1 question each.
1 question each, and 1 answer each.
Yeah.
All right.
Right, is that acceptable?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. Professor,
For me to start?
Yeah, you can start, yeah.
Where do I start from? Up here?
Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
Firstly, let me apologize. I did not mean, and I do not intend to misrepresent. So that was not my intention regarding the question about science. I think we have a genuine difference of opinion here. I believe there are some things that science will never explain, because science restricts its investigations to the natural and to the observable. Okay? So science will never, cannot be able to provide all the answers to the questions that we have. It's a limited remit. Okay? So in that respect, I do believe that's the logical inference of your argument. Science could be able to explain it, but I didn't mean to misrepresent, and so I apologize if that was what you felt. So my question would be, sorry, I've already lost up time. So my question is, how many churches are there in Poland, roughly? You know better than me.
About 50, if you ask about organized churches.
No, any church, anything that calls itself a church, Roman Catholic, Protestant.
Hundreds?
Hundreds?
Yeah.
I would have said thousands, but...
Maybe.
Okay. Does that not constitute evidence for Christianity?
How so?
Because of what I'm saying, the existence of the church is based upon something. And I would put to you that the existence of the church is evidence for Christianity. But that's my question. Did you want to ask one?
Okay, yeah, I would like to follow up if you don't mind.
Sure.
Is not the abundance of, didn't Christ speak, for example, in Matthew 18, in Matthew 16, I'm sorry, didn't he speak about building his church singular? If he spoke about building his church singular, and Paul, when he says that the church is the pillar and the foundation of truth, when he writes that, he uses church singular. How come you have a lot of churches with conflicting doctrines, with conflicting practices, if in fact the gospel was effectively, once and for all, delivered to the saints as the Bible claims?
Thanks for the question. I'm very happy to answer that question. Jesus did say to Peter, I am Peter, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church. I do not believe the church is built on Peter, but I do believe it's built upon Christ. He is the rock on which the church is built. And Peter was the first of the disciples to recognize, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. On this rock, says Jesus, I will build my church. And it is his church because the church is called his bride. It is those people for whom he dies and who come to faith in him. It is one church because although we have many different people and nationalities and all through history and different experiences and everything, every member of the true church is in fact joined to each other because we are joined to the head, which is Christ. Now, many different expressions, that's true, and it does speak in the Bible of false apostles, false teaching, false churches. How do we know which one is true? Well, the ones God has given to us, the Bible, by which we can test truth. And that is the purpose of the preaching here and the activities of the evangelical church here, is to be as faithful as they can to the revealed truth in the Bible. So there is one church, there are many expressions of it, but the one church is in fact those who are united to Christ by faith and love to him. I'm sure that's more than 4 minutes.
Yeah, your turn.
There was one question, one answer. No, Steve,
As far as I'm concerned, whatever. It's like whatever feels all right with you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, my question would be about, do you accept that down through history, skeptical people, sometimes very skeptical from an atheistic background, from a persecuting background, from a hostile background, have been converted by looking at the evidence for the resurrection?
Yeah, I guess I do accept that, and this gives me an opportunity to clarify something else that I would like there to be clarified. I was a skeptic until I was 19 years old, and I know very well this pre-Christian skeptical position, this position of hostility, this position of scorn at times. And then on April the 13th, 2003, I got born again. I fell in love with Jesus Christ. I know very well what does it mean to feel like knowing him personally. I have been there in the place where I could testify that the personal encounter with Jesus changed my life, which was a fact. I fell in love completely with Jesus. I had this experience that the Bible in John chapter 3 calls being born again. I was a new creature. My values changed. My lifestyle changed. I know exactly what you are talking about. The problem is that this took place in my mind. It took place in my emotions. It's not an evidence of that anything real happened, that I felt something. And likewise, it's not evidence that anything real happens when anybody feels something. When you testify that you encounter Jesus, or some other skeptic testifies that he gets convinced by the evidence, this happens inside our mind. If this has any bearing on any reality, this is a completely different question. Wouldn't you agree?
This was a question from your side, Mr. Fjałkowski, or?
Yeah.
It's all in the mind. Is that your question?
Yeah.
I mean, I'm sure I think that people have to make up their own mind on this one themselves. You do have to assess the evidence. I'm glad that you're here to consider the evidence that is being presented, and each of us have to come to our own conclusions based upon the person and work of Jesus Christ. I would respond like this. What is faith? Have you ever thought about that? What is faith? I'll give you my definition of faith. Faith is trust in a reliable person. Faith is trust in a reliable person. If you phone up your mother, who's invited you for lunch on Sunday, and you say, what are we having? And she says, we're going to have, well, in our case, it would be roast beef or something English, you know. Do we doubt that? No. It's your mother, so you believe it. And you go along and you have a nice meal. She's a reliable person. You put your faith in what she says, and you get ready for the meal. Now, question is this. Is there anybody more reliable in history that you'd rather choose to believe than Jesus? I don't think there is. He is completely authentic and reliable. And of course, a Christian comes to that position and trusts him. And that's my definition then of faith. And the experience of being born again, yes, it's something that God does in response to our faith. And I would maintain that that is real, it's definite, it's attested, it's valuable, and my own desire coming here to speak to others is that others may come to that position of faith in the same way that I have.
If that was by any chance this question of would you pick another person rather than Jesus to trust, if it was by any chance directed also to me?
No.
No, okay.
Sorry.
Pity. Now, I would like to follow this definition of faith of yours, if it's all right.
Is it my question or his question?
Yeah, we have more time. We have around 20 minutes. So initially it was 3 questions, 3 answers, but we have still 20 minutes. So we can ask more questions, more answers.
5 minutes for your question.
Right. A question to you.
Okay.
The question to you is this then. I was very surprised to hear that in the Polish legal system, direct evidence is considered the least reliable form of evidence. Okay. Here we have a clear difference between the legal establishment in the UK, I think also in the US and in Poland. For us, in our courts, if someone has been seen to do something by more than 2 or 3 people, then normally, he's guilty or he's not guilty. It's definite. A lawyer has a very easy task to prove guilt if he has 3 people who says, I saw him do it. Okay? So direct evidence is very high. So my question would be, do you accept that on the basis of the English legal system, which is direct evidence, there is direct evidence, multiple sources, people saying, writing down, giving their lives, I saw Jesus risen from the grave after I saw him crucified. Do you accept that that evidence exists?
No, I don't really accept that as evidence, because I'm going to refer to the phrase that I really love, available facts. The eyewitness accounts that the Bible tells us about is not available facts. What is available facts is the text itself, is the Bible itself. So I would not accept such formulation of the circumstances that we have access to the eyewitnesses. We don't. We have access to the text about the eyewitnesses. And this shifts the reliability a lot. Now, I would like to clarify, if I may. I didn't say that direct evidence is the least reliable in Polish courts. I said the eyewitness testimony is the least reliable. It's slightly different in criminal courts generally, because in criminal courts, eyewitnesses is frequently all that you have. But I worked in a civil court with lots of documents. And whenever there is a document, it always takes precedence over eyewitnesses. Whenever there is something signed, whenever the signature is authenticated, whenever you can authenticate the event by something else rather than somebody's testimony. A testimony of a person is always the most troublesome. Therefore, if there were documents that are independent of the will of the people involved, documents that cannot be dealt with, that cannot be corrupted, witnesses' testimonies of disinterested persons, testimonies of persons who had a vested interest against Christianity, the existence of Jesus, the miracles of Jesus, and so on. then that would constitute a more reliable evidence than people who are in the moment of creating a religion, testifying that what they are saying to people is true. Of course they will be saying that they testified that what they are saying to people is true.
But aren't you then saying, it's in the Bible, therefore it can't be true?
Not at all. I say it's in the Bible, it might be true, but it's a long way from that something might be true to that it's evident that it's true.
Let me read you then two statements.
And the burden of proof to shrink this distance, I think, is on your shoulders.
I accept the burden of proof. Let me read to you two statements that I've already presented tonight. He was seen by James, then by all the apostles, and last of all, he was seen by me. That's the Apostle Paul making a statement that he saw the risen Christ. And likewise with John. This is the disciple who testifies to these things, who wrote them down. He's claiming to be an eyewitness. So there's two at least where we have two witnesses there who are claiming to be eyewitnesses. In Luke's case, he's claiming to have consulted multiple eyewitnesses in order to write his Gospels. And so we are dealing, I suggest, with first-hand eyewitness autopsy or statement, written down, testimony, for which these people were willing to die. I put it to you that that's evidence of a very high standard.
May I ask some questions?
Yes.
Okay. Now, again, I would like to say that, okay, maybe I put it in the form of a question. Do you agree that if somebody claims something, it's not evidence of anything other than somebody claims something?
I think that if you have one claim by itself, I could claim to be the King of England. It's clearly false.
Who knows?
No, it's false. I could claim to be but it's false. In the case of the claims of Christ, he's credible. He's credible. And he backs it up by his miracles, by his teaching. And actually, we're talking a lot about the Bible. Can I urge you to read it for yourself? Because it is self-attesting. In other words, when you read it, God speaks through it. And for those who have never read it, I would urge you to read the Gospel of John, which claims to be this eyewitness account, where you get the claims of Christ. Read it for yourself. Is it really the words of a liar, or a madman, or a deluded person? Or does it come over with truth? You read it and see what you think. That's a challenge to everybody.
If that is in order...
No, a challenge.
Yeah, I know, but please allow me to, as strongly as I possibly can, join with Professor Taylor in this challenge. Please read the Bible. I strongly urge you to read the Bible. Don't rely on what other people tell you what is there in the Bible. Read it yourself. It's not a challenge, it's just an urge. Please read it. I've read it, and now I'm happily out of believing it because I have read it. And I wish the same good fortune to all of you. So I urge, even more strongly than Professor Taylor, I urge you to read the Bible.
Thank you.
Now, I would like to clarify one issue. Do you agree that there is a big difference between an eyewitness account and the text? Now, for example, can you talk to Paul today and give him some follow-up questions so that...
Of course not.
Paul is referring to the moment on his road to Damascus when he encountered Jesus, and he was accompanied by some men. Can you now meet these men and confront what Paul is testifying with the testimony of these men?
Of course not.
So it's not really accurate to call it an eyewitness testimony.
No,
right?
It is, because all of history, the events which happened in the last war, the events which happened in the First World War, in the previous events of the last century, the history of your country and of mine, we can't talk to Adolf Hitler We can't talk to Joseph Stalin. We can't put these men under the spotlight now, can we? Does that mean that what we have is invalid? Of course not. We treat it as historical evidence. We have their writings, we have their beliefs, we have their thoughts, we have what they did, and we have the resulting situation that we find ourselves in today. So to suggest that because we can't cross-question historical personages, it's the evidence is somehow of a lesser standard, I do not accept that.
Well, I would gladly hear a historian speak about this issue. If we have some testimony of Hitler about the war, and we have documents about the war, and we have destruction of the war, and we have all the material, objective things about the war, I would like a historian speak out which takes precedence. And is it not the case that we can rely on somebody's testimony over what happened during the war only because we have some external evidence, material evidence to test it? But I would like to ask you the question I planned to, if I may.
I think, I'm not sure what our time is, whether we have questions from the floor or...
We have still 10 minutes for answering questions.
Please go ahead.
Okay. So, Professor Taylor, why exactly are you a Christian?
Why am I a Christian? Well, that's a good question, isn't it? I am persuaded by the evidence, basically. I am persuaded by the person and work of Jesus Christ. I do believe he's credible, trustworthy. I do believe in the historicity of the Bible and all of the things that we read there. And I do believe that God worked in my life and in my situation, in my experience, to bring me to those convictions. So I think that's a summary of why I'm a Christian.
Yeah, but is it that you were convinced of the evidence by yourself, or is it a work of God that you got convinced by the evidence?
That's a difficult question. Actually, I think it's both. I do believe in the sovereignty of God, that God is in control of circumstances and in fact everything, but that also that humans they have a free agency. And so I do believe and when those two come together, then that is the miracle that we call conversion. That's my perspective.
So are you saying that getting convinced by the evidence is somehow a choice of a free will?
No, I'm saying that conversion is, let me put it in a Bible situation. In the Gospel of John, we find these words. As many as received him, talking of Christ, to those he gave the power to become sons of God, even to those who believe on his name. John chapter 1 and verse 12. So those who receive Christ, those who will welcome Christ, those who will follow Christ, to those he gives the power to become children of God, to those who believe on his name. You have the activity of the human response, and you have also the activity of God. Sometimes I'm asked to speak at weddings. It's always a very happy occasion when two people get married. And again, in an English wedding, the priest or the pastor will say, "Do you accept this woman to be your wedded wife?" And the groom will say, "I do." And then he will turn to the woman and say, "Do you accept this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" And she will say, "I do." And when both say, "I do," or "I will," then they're pronounced man and wife. And I think that's a great illustration of conversion. I think what happens when a person becomes a Christian, they say to Christ, "I will." And he says to them, "I will." And that relationship of love begins, which of course we're told in the Bible lasts forever, and which human marriage is a picture. So that's a long answer, but that's what I believe about happens at conversion.
Thank you for this analogy of the wedding, because it allows me to ask my question more forcefully. If you actually make a commitment which is comparable to the commitment at the wedding, does it not in fact jeopardize your objectivity when you look at works of historians, archaeologists, other kinds of scientists? If you made a decision, if you made a commitment with the most important person in your life, with God, now, does it not pose a threat which a skeptic does not have at all? Does it not pose a threat to your way of looking at the evidence in only one direction? Isn't that the accurate description of what's happening?
A good question. Actually, in the case of my marriage, I'm still married, and it's 35 years on, so we're still holding in there, you know, it's still going on. So it hasn't made a difference to my marriage, the fact that I committed myself to my wife on our wedding day. And yeah, I'm in for the long haul there, okay? And when you love someone, you do that, yeah? Now, in the case of Christ, all I've found about Christ since I first came to know him is good and better than when I experienced it the first. So as a young Christian, as a teenager, from an atheistic background, coming to personal faith in Christ, I didn't know very much. I had questions. I can honestly say all of those questions have been answered. Subsequent issues have been answered. My faith is stronger now than it was then. My knowledge is certainly better than it was then. It was a pretty low start. I didn't have much to start with, so it's increased since then. And all I can say honestly is that I've looked at some of these questions that Mr. Fjałkowski has brought tonight, and I've found in every case there to be satisfactory answers, more than satisfactory actually, in the objections that have been brought. So my testimony 35 years on is that I'm more convinced now than I was at the start. That's as honestly as I can say.
Can you testify that you have been looking fairly at both sides of the argument?
Absolutely. I'll tell you, when I started, as a student, I used to go to Speaker's Corner. Has anyone ever been to Speaker's Corner in London? It's a very famous place. You can have any possibility there, and you have Muslims, you have Zionists, you have Labour, you have Conservative, you even have the extreme right wing, you have lots of Christians, you have some Christians which are very different to my perspective, and you have some which go to reason and debate, and I would put myself in those categories. Often we would have people from the atheist society called the free thinkers, and they would come, and sometimes their questions were very difficult. If I couldn't answer the question on the day, and this often happened, I would say, well, I'll come back to you next week. And I would check it out. I would see, well, is there an answer? What's the answer about the prophecy of Nebuchadnezzar or all of these different things? In every case, I'd say two things. In every case, I found there was a satisfactory answer. But in no case did I find that the questioner was happy with the answer. In fact, he was not even happy that I offered an answer. Why was that? Because he was more interested in questions than answers. He wasn't interested in the answer. He was just interested in posing the question. In other words, he wanted not to believe, and his questions were a justification for an unbelieving position. That was my experience. So I like to debate in a respectful manner, and I must compliment Mr. Fjałkowski for his clearness and honesty and transparency, being willing to be cross-questioned by me. And I find no hostility here at all. Difference of view, complete disagreement of perspective, but nothing personal. And isn't that how it should be in these sort of encounters? So different often from my friends at Speaker's Corner, who would be less reasonable, I think, than you have shown yourself to be. Is it my turn for a question?
Yeah, we have 3 minutes. So
3 minutes. Oh.
Mr. Fjałkowski was asking a few questions. Now, Professor Taylor, we have the chance.
Okay.
Maybe last one.
Do you accept that leading legal minds, such as Lord Lyndhurst, Jonathan Copley, there are other legal minds, Lord Caldecott, Lord Denning, Lord Mackay, Lord Darling. These are chief justices in the English legal establishment. Do you accept that they are convinced by the evidence for the resurrection?
Thank you for mentioning that, in fact. No, I do not accept that as evidence.
That's not my question. My question is, do you accept that they have been convinced?
Do I accept the fact that they have been convinced?
Yes.
No, I do not. I think there is good evidence, there is a good reason to think that they may in fact not be telling the truth. And I lack the knowledge to back my claim, but maybe you could help me. In England, today, maybe earlier when those gentlemen lived, how well would it be received in the society, in the legal arena, in the gentry society? How well would that be received if somebody openly stated, I am an atheist, I don't believe these things?
No. Lord Mackay is still alive.
Okay, one of them, okay.
Okay. Lord Denning is not too far away. He was alive when I was a young man. So these are not all figures from ancient history. And actually, I can't really allow that you won't accept their testimony, because they're saying and they're writing, I believe the evidence, and I believe it to be true.
Can I clarify?
Are they not allowed to say that and for you to accept that?
Can I clarify? These people have high stakes in saying that rather than something else. These people have career stakes, society stakes. These people have massive vested interests to say things that make their careers unjeopardized. So, as far as I know, poorly, the history of England maybe, openly declaring yourself as a non-believer, as a skeptic, as an atheist, it doesn't concern England, it concerns Poland, concerns any other country probably. In the elites, in the aristocracy, in the gentry, or in any kind of elitist kind of society, is not well received. It will jeopardize, and has for centuries. And I believe when I assess, if I am to judge whether or not to accept this as evidence of something important, I would rather ask these people, and I would rather examine if my suspicions are true, that they say, this is my suspicion, this is my hypothesis that needs examining, but this is my hypothesis for now, that what they say and what they write is much more because of their personal situation than their sincere beliefs.
I can only read what Lyndhurst said. He's a law lord. It's the highest legal office in the UK. He's done it 3 times. He's a Cambridge University graduate. He graduated second in his class in mathematics from Trinity College, Cambridge. He's an extremely intelligent guy. And he says this, I know pretty well what evidence is. I tell you, such evidence as that for the resurrection has never broken down yet. He's a law lord. He knows the evidence better than anybody in this room, I suggest. And he's convinced by the evidence for the resurrection.
Closing remarks. So 5 minutes each, and we start from you, Professor Taylor.
Could we have the, could I put on the projector, please? I just wanted to show the last part. Just while that's coming up, let me read to you what happened to Paul, the apostle. He said this. He's a Christian, and he said, I've been in prison more frequently, been flogged more severely, and been exposed to death again and again. 5 times I received from the Jews 40 lashes minus 1. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was pelted with stones. 3 times I was shipwrecked. I spent a night and day in the sea. I have been constantly on the move. I have been in danger from rivers, in danger from bandits, in danger from my fellow Jews, in danger from the Gentiles, in danger in the city, in danger in the country, in danger at sea, and in danger from false believers. I have toiled and gone without sleep. I have known hunger and thirst, and often gone without food. I have been cold and naked. Now, where's the vested interest here? Do you see much vested interest in that? Why would he do that? Would you do that? I wouldn't do that unless it was true. So let me go right to the end here. I want to go back to the from the current slide. If we can Okay. Can you bring the next one up? I don't know where the clicker is. Maybe it's here. Yeah. Okay. So this is Sergei and Yulia Skripal. Forgive my poor pronunciation of the Russian. Last month, they were attacked in Salisbury in the UK with a military-grade nerve agent developed in the Soviet Union. It's called Novichok. That is agreed by everybody, including the Russians, that they were attacked, that it was nerve agent, that Novichok was a chemical that was developed in the Soviet Union. But the Russians claim complete innocence about this. The British say the Russians had a motive because he's a former spy. They had the means because they have agents in the UK. And they have the method because they produced Novichok, which is military grade, made to a high purity, not mixed up in someone's kitchen. But the Russians deny everything, in spite of the evidence. Who do you think is right? Let me give you another one. This one happened in November 2006. Alexander Litvinenko, a former member of the FSB, defected to the British. He had a cup of tea in a Mayfair cafe in November with two former members of the FSB. At the end of the drink of tea, after his friends had left, he felt sick and he went to the hospital and said, "I've been poisoned." 23 days later, he died in agony from massive internal failure to all of his organs. In his drink of tea had been some polonium-210, which is an alpha particle emitter, extremely lethal poison. But alpha particles leave a trail of radioactivity, which the police were able to follow all over London. They were able to check it in the hotel room where his two friends had stayed. They were able to check it on the plane that took them back to the Soviet Union. They were able to find the trace of the chemical on the seat where one of his friends was sitting. And still, the Russians say, no evidence. Who do you believe? Can you see that it's possible to be presented with massive evidence and still you won't believe? Is there anybody so foolish as to think the Russians had nothing to do with it? By the way, Litvinenko foolishly said some very bad things about Mr. Putin in July. This happened in November. Who do you believe? When it comes to the resurrection, the evidence is massive. Who do you believe? That's my final challenge tonight.
Right now,
Okay, let me please first address very briefly what has just been said. I can tell you what my interest was when I was proclaiming Christianity to whoever I met when I was a Christian. My vested interest was I believe it was true. I believe my friends are going to hell, and I wanted to rescue them from hell. I sincerely believe that was true. It compelled me very much. I was totally, utterly unbearable. But now, I don't think that was true. It's not true that the only reason why people suffer these inconveniences is that the message is true. They suffer because they believe it's true, and it's something completely different. And there again, we have a claim inside the claim, and not the available facts. It's a huge misrepresentation to present me or other skeptics or atheists or whoever as somebody analogous to the Russians in this last case. We don't have an interest in this case. We are not convincing anybody of anything. We are not accused of anything. We are not defending ourselves. So this is a wrong analogy, if I may say so. There are not two sides of the issue. There is only one side of the issue who claims something and who needs to produce evidence. I am not claiming anything. I just say I don't believe that the data is convincing evidence. Now, when I think that it is a huge overstatement, to say the very least, to suggest that Christianity is evidence-based. I suspected the debate to go into more in a scientific realm than the forensic realm. So I would like to issue a warning that I think should be issued about science. Science is based on evidence. It's really based on evidence. It gets its credibility from doubting and from testing. Religion, including Christian religion, gets its credibility by demonizing doubt, and I mean demonizing doubt, that doubt is a work of Satan, and precluding testing. Religion discourages critical thinking. You know the story of the doubting Thomas in John 20. Except I shall see in his hands the print of the nails, and put my finger into the print of the nails, and thrust my hand into his side, I will not believe. Did Jesus compliment this critical thinking on the part of Thomas? No, Jesus rebuked him. Thomas, because thou hast seen me, thou hast believed. Blessed are they that have not seen and yet have believed. In Luke chapter 5, we have the following dialogue. Jesus said to Simon, launch onto the deep and let down your nets. And Simon answered unto him, Master, we have toiled all the night and have taken nothing. Nevertheless, at thy word I will let down the net. I have heard many sermons in many different churches how wonderful this is, that Simon said, at thy word I shall cast the net. But is it in any way surprising that one of the most respectable scientific establishments in the world, the Royal Society, has adopted the motto, nullius in verba, take nobody's word for it. Religious claims are deliberately designed to be not prone to being tested. Claims are, by design, untestable. What is the spirit? Well, it is something. What exactly does the soul do relative to the mind? Well, it has to do something. What evidence do you have for the efficiency of prayer? Well, God answers prayers differently. Where exactly was the Garden of Eden? Well, it must have been somewhere. Where and when was the Tower of Babel? Well, it must have been somewhere, we don't know. It was a long time ago. When can I get convinced by whether or not there is heaven and hell? Well, after you die. Did you see the pattern here? And finally, and most importantly, how can I find God? Where is he? How can I experience him? How can I get convinced? Even despite of my will, even despite of my weaknesses, I would like to be convinced of the truth, whatever my attitude towards it might be. My emotions, my will, I would like evidence. I try in my everyday life, I would like evidence to trump whatever will or emotions I would have against it. And God started as living at the bottom of a cave, then he lived at the top of a high mountain, then he had his throne over the dome, which is heaven, and then now he is beyond space and time, whatever that even means. Why cannot we simply have evidence that sincere people would agree that is convincing? Science is evidence-based, even more. Science is evidence-driven. Religion is faith-based. It hijacks evidence only if the evidence matches with its objective and unchangeable beliefs, or at least the current or local version of them. Please do not confuse the two for the sake of others and for the sake of yourself. May I use the time which is out of time to thank the organizers. For my part, I would like to warmly thank Professor Taylor. It was a great privilege. I enjoyed it very much. It's not true from my side that there is nothing personal. Well, there is a lot of personal sympathy from my side, sir. And I appreciate it very much that you agreed to take part in this debate. Thank you, First Baptist Church in Wrocław, for staging this debate. Thank you, the organizers. And let me use this opportunity to specially thank a very special person, the mastermind behind this debate and many other events organized by the Panteon Foundation. The most skillful organizer I have ever met, and I'm so fortunate to work with him on a regular basis. The president of the Panteon Foundation, please join me in giving a well-deserved round of applause for Maciej Mikurda. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you guys. Thank you for coming for today's debate. I know, Taylor, would you like to say something of special thanks also for Mr. Fjałkowski? Okay, so from our side, thank you very much for today's time, for coming, for debates. It was quite nice, really. So it was done in not hostile way. It's a very calm way, very, first time I saw many debates, but this one was very, very peaceful.